Welcome back, everybody. Our StoryFest Saturday isn't quite over just yet. Our final panel of the afternoon is an extra special one. We are honored to welcome back Tessa McGovern, as well as Patricia Dunn, as they launch their brand new podcast, Go Ahead, Write Something. And joining Tessa and Pat today is Naomi Novik. Yeah, let's pause for applause. Naomi is the acclaimed New York Times bestselling author of the Nebula Award-winning novel Uprooted, Spinning Silver, and the 9-volume Temeraire series, as well as a founder of the Archive of Our Own. Her upcoming book, The Golden Enclaves, is the third of the Scholomance trilogy and will be available September 2022. And we wanted to announce we are selling Naomi's books. Promotional copies of the Scholomance Student Handbook will be available as a free gift with the purchase of any of her books while supplies last. So make sure to come on over there. Jean Marie, our teen librarian, is holding it up right there. And Naomi will be doing signings after the panel right in that area as well. So please give a warm welcome to Pat, Tessa, and Naomi.
We've got a lot of dead space right now. Welcome, welcome. So nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. Familiar faces and new faces. So we are delighted to have Naomi as our launch guest. It's really an honor. And welcome to Go Ahead, Write Something, the podcast for writers who want motivation, the nitty-gritty and more gritty about getting published and how to find joy in writing your stories and sharing them with the world. I'm Tessa McGovern, author and writing teacher at the Writing Institute, Sarah Lawrence College, as well as the teacher of 2 free weekly writing sprints on Zoom for the library's Westport Writes program.
Hi, I'm Patricia Dunn, AKA TM Dunn. That's a whole story that we don't have time to tell right now. I'm a novelist, and I'm the executive director of Westport Writers Workshop. And I've been teaching emerging and established writers for over 20 years, and I'm so excited that Naomi is our guest today. As you've heard, New York Times bestselling author, and if I wasn't such a fan of her work, I'd be very jealous. And I want to thank all of you for coming today, and this is really a thrill.
So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
So Naomi has so many awards, we couldn't possibly go through them all, but she did just win one this week, a Lodestar Award for the second book in her Scholomance trilogy. So I think that's worth a special round of applause.
Thank you. It's nice to hear it because I wasn't actually able to be at Worldcon this year. Because as I was telling Tessa and Pat, I was on a glamorous weekend of childcare and doing IT for my parents. So I did not get to celebrate properly, in my opinion.
Your niece did throw up, you said, right?
Yes, yeah, you know, that's
It's not at all what you would picture
not super glamorous.
a glamorous author, not on the day of your award.
Yeah.
So tell us what inspires you to tell the stories that you tell.
I don't actually know. I don't know that I can sort of say a specific inspiration. I'm always inspired. I feel like I'm routinely inspired by other stories. You know, typically, almost always, I think, and I could say that about all my professional work and all my fan fiction work. Fan fiction is sort of more obvious about this, but almost all of my work is in conversation with something. And sometimes that conversation is me yelling at it loudly, and sometimes it's more of a dialogue, and very often it's more, when a story comes alive in me, it's typically because there's a story that's alive already, and I start thinking about, but what if things were different? That's usually, in fact, one of the things that sometimes happens to me very often is like, well, that could never happen. And then I immediately start thinking about how that could happen.
So it's, well, with Uprooted, and as the people who actually know Spinning Silver, they were based on fairy tales, Beauty and the Beast and Rumpelstiltskin. Did you know when you were starting to write, well, especially Uprooted, that it was going to be based on a fairy tale? Did you start with that idea? Or?
No, so Uprooted is not actually initially based on Beauty and the Beast. Probably the strongest inspiration for it is a Polish fairy tale called Agnieszka Skrawek Nieba, which means Agnieszka Scrap of Sky. And it's
I couldn't say that, so
it's a story that I read when my mother read to me when I was very small. And it's a very simple story about a young girl, a small child, which is one of the reasons why I loved it so much as a small child, who goes into a wood that's haunted by a dark sorcerer and then breaks the curse by recognizing that the people on the other side of the forest are just like her. And so, but that was just, that actually, I didn't know that that was the inspiration until I was about 20,000 words in, because the immediate inspiration for it was I was in the middle of book 8 of the Temeraire series. And in the Temeraire series, the dragons are very realist. They're meant to feel like real sort of physical animals that obey the laws of physics. They don't obey the laws of physics, but they're meant to feel that way, right? That's the conceit. That's what I'm trying to sell to you, the reader, when you're reading those books, that to sort of make it possible to imagine them in the context of the sailing ships, the war, and so there's a lot of realistic detail. They're not fantastical in the same ways. I mean, they're fantasy creatures, but they're not meant to feel sort of magical, right? In the Temeraire series, but I love magical dragons. And so around book 8, I was a little bit like, I want to write some magical dragons. And I wrote the first line of Uprooted, which is, our dragon doesn't eat the girls he takes. And that's basically how all my work starts. It starts with the first line. I write the first line and I'm like, well, I don't know what happens next. I guess I better, if I'm interested, I want to find out more, then I have to write it. So that's typically what motivates me. And so with Uprooted, I wrote that line, and gradually, I would say, over the first 15,000 words, I sort of started chasing that line, discovered that the dragon was not, in fact, a cool fantasy dragon like I wanted to write. It was a wizard. But it was okay. By then, the story was alive. The story was moving. And that's, I would say, how a lot of my stuff happens.
And so you're obviously a discovery writer, clearly. You don't use Save the Cat or any of those sort of story structure.
Save the Dragon. Sorry, how to get that?
I don't actually know that structure. I don't know anything about formal structures, right?
No.
You know, it's very much discovery for me, largely because my primary motivation for writing a book is finding out what happens next. And if I know what's going to happen next, then I don't need to write it down. I mean, having a contract does help occasionally. You're like, I will have to pay back money if I don't actually write it down. But very often, for me, the excitement is figuring it out. Is that moment where I've been writing along and suddenly I figure out another piece of the puzzle drops in. The theme suddenly reveals itself, and when those instants happen, oh, it's so great. And that feeling is what I'm constantly chasing as a writer.
So do you think of your audience or a audience when you're writing? Because I know a lot of your books have crossed over.
Yeah, no, I don't think about audience. I don't think about audience at all, because I'm writing for myself.
Okay.
I will say that one of the things about that is I tend to find that that if I like something, I'm not super, my own tastes are not super niche. Like, my tastes are sort of fairly mainstream, I would say. They're sometimes unusual, but if I like something, I find that other people like it too, which helps.
So that's just so that's not too intimidating to newer writers. Could you talk about the amount of reading and the amount of fan fiction writing you did beforehand? Because it's very intimidating as a new writer to think, oh, I can just launch off into a novel and I'll get it right enough that it's going to work.
Well, speak for yourself, Tessa.
Yeah,
Some of us have no problem.
For me, obviously, for 10 years, I started seriously writing, I would say. I was a sophomore in college, and I was on a hall with a lot of women scientists in my dorm, and once a week, we would all pile into the one double room. We all had single rooms. We'd all pile into the one double room and watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, of which the very first episode that I saw was The Inner Light. That was a good place to start. And I just got completely hooked on it. And once a week was not enough. And one of my friends told me at this time, this was literally before the web, but my university had a VAX VMS server, and you could sign on it and get onto a mailing list called Strek-L. And when I got on this mailing list, it was people talking about the episodes, but it was also people were posting fan fiction. And that was my first, I'd written some fan fiction just for myself, but it was my first idea you could write this and share it with people. And I wrote for fan fiction for 10 years, and that was my hobby. That was not something, I wasn't doing it deliberately to learn how to write, but it works,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And since we're on the topic, should we talk about OA3 right now? Would you like to?
AO3.
AO3, I beg your
Yes.
pardon. Got the
Sure.
initials the wrong way around.
Yeah. Right, Archive of Our Own is one of the largest archives of fan fiction online. We started Archive of Our Own, I and a group of other people, partly because at that time we were finding that, and this is still the case, social media, online communities are fragile to the extent that they're owned by commercial entities. Because if they stop making money, the commercial entity that owns it, the company that owns it, is going to try and change it. They will change it in response to advertiser pressure if it's paid by advertisers. They will often simply shut it down. They will routinely destroy accounts. And so content was essentially being lost. And oftentimes we saw that many of these sites felt fairly exploitative. And so a group of us sort of said, we need an archive of our own, obviously in an homage to A Room of One's Own. And we put it together. It's a completely nonprofit site. It's supported totally by donations. It's not even supported by grants. It's coded almost entirely by volunteers.
What does it do for writers, if I may?
So it's basically just an archive for fan fiction. And it has, the main notable features is that, you have total control over your work. There is no advertising. It's not meant to make money. And it's designed for fan fiction readers because all of us who were doing it were readers. And more broadly, that's one of the great things about being in fan fiction and being in the fan fiction community as both a writer and a reader, which is very often, right, when you do writing workshops, it's very hard to find a writing workshop where the people in it with you want to read what you are writing. Very often there's a kind of quid pro quo going on. I'll read your thing and you'll read my thing, and we'll try and give each other advice. In fandom, typically it's the other way around. There's like a giant voracious maw that wants more, because that's kind of the idea, that's the definition of fan, right? A fanfic. And also, it's a giant voracious maw full of people who have strong opinions about the characters and settings that you're writing about, and who will tell you if they think you got it wrong, which is very hard. You got your original character wrong. Well, you could say, no, I didn't. This is how I meant them to be. And so, in fact, it's excellent training for things like nailing character voice, thinking about character consistency. And broadly, fan fiction allows you to write as a writer. If you're thinking about it in this practiced way, which I didn't myself. I was just doing it like a hobby. But if you're thinking about it in a sort of systematic way, with fan fiction, you can focus in any story on the piece that you want to write, right? If you want to write original characters, there's no greater practice than, say, write a Harry Potter story with your own original characters in it, right? If you want to focus on plot, you take existing characters and setting and come up with a new plot for them, right? And,
So cool.
yeah.
So this is a little bit off, well, kind of on topic or off topic, but so you've created these amazing characters, but there must have been one character that was the most challenging, that you almost wanted to walk away from, but couldn't.
You know, for me, it never feels that way.
Give us something.
I'm sorry.
Come on,
I'm sorry.
It's sounding a little bit too easy.
No.
I want to hear some struggle.
It's not that it's
Can't be all
the
fun.
problem is, I'm sorry, it's fun. I like writing. That's why I'm a writer.
Well, she's also a coder.
Yes. But look, I wrote fan fiction for 10 years. Nobody was paying me a dime. I did it because I love to write. And now I still write fan fiction when I'm not writing professional fiction. It's how I procrastinate. You know, and often, in fact, I find that when I'm writing fan fiction, I'm exploring in quicker ways ideas that often then.
Oh, that's so
come back.
interesting.
Do you have a favorite character?
It's whichever character I'm writing right now.
I knew you were going to say that.
Sorry,
All right.
you know, but
That's
but
okay.
it's true because that's the character that's alive in me at
Yes,
the
of
moment. Those are the
course.
characters who are alive in me. And, but for me, you know, in terms of building character, the piece that for me that makes it not typically a grind is that for me, character, plot, and world all build one another, and they build at the same time in my stories. So for instance, with Uprooted, right, I wrote that first line. It was in first person. I didn't know that Agnieszka was the character's name until I was literally like 10,000 words in, and one of the other characters had to call her by something. And I was like, what's her name? Agnieszka. And then I was like, oh, this is in Poland, right? And it's not literally in Poland. It's in my 3-year-old version of Poland, the 3-year-old me version of Poland, which came out of fairy tale books. But so each, and then what happens is when I discover something like that, I go back and I change what I've already written in order to work that knowledge deeper into the piece. And so you can't tell that I didn't know from the start, but I didn't. And typically what the process that's happening in my work consistently is, you know, I write a line, something like that. Our dragon doesn't eat the girls he takes. Who's the dragon? Who are these girls? Where are they? Why is he taking them? You know, what is he doing with them, right? Those are the line itself contains the questions that I then have to answer for myself in the next line. And as I write each line, that's kind of what's happening. It's sort of an accumulation of questions. And so I had to figure out, you know, that where the setting was. And once I knew about the setting, then my character has to make some choices. Whenever a character makes a choice, whenever a character acts, that's when the character gets built, right? It's what characters choose to do given their situation and setting.
And you just have in your mind, you know there's got to be a catalyst or an inciting incident, so you know you're looking for something big to happen.
I mean, very often, you know, as soon as I wrote that line, doesn't eat the girls he takes. So he's taking girls, and obviously that was going to be, you know, I knew pretty quickly, right, that my character was going to be the one who was being taken. And that was obviously going to be a significant moment, and I had to figure out why was she taken. I didn't know that for quite some time into the story, but she didn't know it either, so it was fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Spinning Silver, because this line totally brought me in to the book, and I was wondering if you wrote this first, or did it come later? The real story isn't half as pretty as the one you've heard.
Yes.
So that line came first.
Yes.
And did you know?
So, you know, with Spinning Silver had a slightly interesting genesis, which is there was a short story anthology that I was asked to participate in called The Starlit Wood, wonderful anthology, and they asked all the writers to choose a fairy tale to sort of be inspired by, and either to retell it, to just be inspired by it. It was wide open. and they gave us a long list of fairy tales, and I procrastinated until everybody else had chosen most of their fairy tales, and there was a very short list left. But in fact, the last few iterations, they kept sending it to me saying, so which story are you going to do? We're really close to the deadline. Which story are you doing? And Rumpelstiltskin was on it. And you know, Rumpelstiltskin, for me, had some significant, it has power for me because of the anti-Semitic elements in it, and the evocation of gold, and in particular, my grandmother, I knew from sort of fragmentary stories that I got growing up, had once been arrested for smuggling gold. She was behind the Iron Curtain, and what happened is people would smuggle gold out for dollars, which was extremely illegal because they were trying to control the value of the currency. And so that was there. There was a thread there that was sort of calling to me from that story. And as I started trying to sit there and engage with it, I suddenly realized that the story itself, I wanted to talk about the story as if the story was in this world. So the story Rumpelstiltskin is known in the world of Spinning Silver. It is a story that is known and is told in Spinning Silver. And my character is a young Jewish girl. She's the daughter of a moneylender. And for her, she experiences that story as an attack, as hostility towards her. And I knew that was kind of my starting point.
That's great.
Fascinating. Could we go back to, at the end of your 10 years of writing fan fiction, the transition from the fan fiction writing to that first published book? Could you tell us about that?
So my transition was interesting. I'd been working on a computer science degree for most of the time that I was writing fan fiction. And I wanted to work on computer games. And I had just finished my master's. I was sort of, I was in a PhD program, but I sort of was like, I just want to start making things. And I got an offer to be on a small team that was building the expansion set for a game called Neverwinter Nights, if any of you have played it, yay. So I got to work on Shadows of Untitled. I came up with the name. Woo! Pat myself in the back. And so what happened on that, because of the way that computer games work, right, so before then, sorry, to back up, as a fan fiction writer, I almost always worked in 5,000 words or less. It was just quick vignettes, short pieces. That's what I was doing. On a computer game, you have to architect out the story far more significantly. You have to plan it out because you're not working on it alone. There were 3 acts to our story. The artists needed to know what the cinematics, the movies in the midpoints and at the start and end of the game were going to be, so they could start working on them while we were actually writing and building the game. And we were also there were 3 designers on the project, and each of us was going to take one of the acts. So we had to have our characters shared, and we had to know where our characters were going to be. Things like, these are side characters, so you're the sidekicks for the player. And the story had to be written in such a way that you could play it in anything as a lawful good paladin to a chaotic evil, I don't know, dormouse. I mean, basically like this gigantic range of possible player interactions. And something about the process of working on that game really kind of hooked a sort of engineering, maybe architectural side of my brain in with the sort of character vignette moments that I was working on in fanfic. And after I finished it, and so separately, the other piece of this, of my career as a novelist, was that I was working about 100 hours a week on this game. And at the end of it, we had to go and work on the beta test in Edmonton, Canada in February. Because that is where the company was based. Yes. And at the time, in fact, there was not a significant computer game industry in New York, where I live, in Manhattan. And And so after I'd been in Edmonton, Canada for 3 weeks, I was like, maybe I don't want to move to, maybe I don't want to, like, I'm not going to be able to do this full time. And maybe this is not, and I sort of was like, I want creative control. And I don't want to have to worry about the animation budget. And one of my friends said, you should write a book. And so I wrote about 40,000 words of a book. It was terrible. I could tell it was terrible. It was not alive. I was just sort of trying to make something happen, and it wasn't alive in me. It wasn't living. And finally, I just sort of was like, nah, never mind. I'm going to go, get a job. And I went and had an interview at a company that shall remain nameless, but that does internet advertising. And it was 6 hours of interviews with 12 people, and I walked out. I was like, maybe I'll try writing another novel. I did not. That's a good story, but I'm a good storyteller. So that is not necessarily exactly how it really happened, but close enough. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So you revised it?
No, I didn't. I never went back to that.
No.
What actually happened at the same time was that I saw the movie Master and Commander with Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany by Peter Weir. And I came out of the movie, I was like, yeah, that was okay. Well, maybe I'll pick up the book. 2 weeks later, I have torn through all 21 Aubrey Maturin books. I've seen the movie 3 more times, dragging anybody who would come to it with me again. And I started writing fan fiction for it, because that's what I do. And, in retrospect, I sort of look at the fan fiction stories. So the first one that I wrote was a little vignette-y thing, like 5,000. The next one was about 10,000. The next one was 15,000 words. The next one was like 23,000 words. And you could literally sort of plot the curve of sort of an integration happening. And at some point, I sat down and I was like, what if one of them was a dragon? And I started writing it, and I very quickly realized, and this is still my benchmark for when I'm writing original fiction versus when I'm writing fan fiction, which is I started feeling the characters of the original source feeling like a box that was holding me in. I was like, no, I don't want to keep these characters consistent, because actually once you turn a person into a dragon, it turns out they change quite a lot. And I want to explore what it would be like to think in the mindset of a dragon. What if a dragon was a person, right? I'm a huge fan of Anne McCaffrey and the Pern books. But in Pern is obviously has that classic thing of the dragon rider and dragon bonding, which is just, catnip to my soul. And but at the same time, the dragons in the Pern books are not really people. Like, we don't get to sort of see them. We don't get to think about their motivations. They just sort of seem like pets that occasionally telepathically talk to you and can teleport. And so I wanted to sort of think about, what if you really had a dragon, and what if the other character was really quite unwilling, right? Because to me, that felt like a much more interesting dynamic than the sort of much more positive relationship from the Aubrey Maturin books. And so I ended up realizing I didn't actually want to do it as fan fiction. I wanted to write it as original fiction. I wanted the characters to really be my own and let them become. And so I stopped writing the fanfic story, and I started over with my own character names and the setting of finding the dragon egg. And I went to all my beta readers, the people who read all my fan fiction, and was like, do you guys like this? Is this good? Do you think I should keep going? And people were like, yes, we want to know more. And that was Temeraire.
That is fascinating. And the relationship between the dragon and the officer, did you have an inspiration for that? Because that is like catnip to the soul.
I didn't have a specific inspiration for that, other than to feel very clearly that what I wanted it to be was a marriage, right? And a marriage, a marriage of true minds, right? In the sense of, in a healthy, good marriage, my idea of it, there isn't one partner that's subordinate to the other. That it has to nurture and nourish both partners, and that obviously it's frequently a source of intense conflict. And the big question is not, are they going to get together? It's, are they going to stay together? Are they going to get over the obstacles and the challenges to the relationship that come at them? And that I could see really clearly that I wanted to be with Lawrence as he is essentially forced into that kind of relationship, which would not have been his expectation, obviously, societally in the time. And watching a character effectively become a fish out of water, because a character who is so used to being absolutely in water, right, being dragged out of it, and still being good enough to sort of do that sincerely and honorably, right?
No, when we were in the room upstairs, Naomi and Tessa, both fantasy writers, were talking so much about dragons in such a realistic way. I actually had to think, are dragons real? And because I did ask that question, because I thought, well, maybe, but you keep referring to magical dragons. So this is an ignorant question from somebody who does not write fantasy. So what is the difference between a dragon and a magical dragon?
Well, obviously, I mean, the
temporary,
the temporary dragons, right, are meant to feel realistic.
Okay.
They're obviously not. They're, if you actually sort of looked at the rate of cow consumption, yes. The planet would have to be slightly larger.
I was thinking, like, are there really dragons?
Yeah.
Okay.
But so more broadly, I wanted the dragons because it was about being in the Napoleonic Wars with dragons, right? It was about the thought experiment is, so what would be different? How would it be different if you had an air force in the Napoleonic Wars, and having it be an air force that's sort of based on animals, on living creatures as opposed to machines, gives it many of the same constraints that, for instance, the sailing ships had. And I thought that was quite interesting. That's why I sort of felt like the Napoleonic Wars were a good point for the kinds of dragons that I was writing about, these very large dragons who could have crews, that there were enough interesting parallels to the sailing ships and to the sailing technology and the military technology of the time. You could imagine a cannon being a real danger to a dragon. And you could also imagine a dragon being a real danger to a troop of infantry or to a sailing ship. And so it felt like there was enough of a level playing field. It wasn't, dragons are nuclear bombs that are just going to lay waste to anything. And that can be interesting too. But in this case, I really wanted that sort of, that life of the almost ordinary life, like we've got to wash the dragon, we got to, hook up the rigging, we've got to pack all the supplies for our flight, everybody's got to get in their position aboard, we've got to have somebody waving the signal flags to the other dragons so we can communicate in battle, and all that sort of minutia, right? The value of it is that, it's sort of like a desk clerk in hell, right? It's sort of, you think about it, you can make things that are extraordinarily fantastical and could not exist at all feel very concrete and real and believable by saddling them with some degree of minutia and an accurate minutia, obviously, that was really heavily researched. And in contrast, in Uprooted, in Spinning Silver, I was aiming much more for a sense of fairy tale quality, right? I wanted it to be, I sort of had this very clear idea in my head of these sort of these very sort of soft watercolor kind of illustrations that you might get in a picture book, that, it's not, there isn't a map of the world, there isn't, an exact period that you can nail the clothing and the buildings down to. I was trying very hard not to nail those down because I wanted it to feel like this sort of, you don't know what's at the edges of the map. And the story is here, on that, that fairy tale quality. And in there, so then you can have magic spells, right? You don't have, there's no magic spells, no wizards in Temeraire. There's guns in Temeraire, and the dragons have to be fed. They don't fly by magic. There's, it's a bit hand-waved, but for instance, when I was designing the dragons, when I was thinking about their speed, I looked at what do people think that the highest speed that pterodactyls and pteranodons could reach. When I looked at the weight, I sort of was looking at a Tyrannosaurus, right? I tried to find references that were enough in the material world to keep me from going to Ancalagon the Black territory, right? Where, probably many of you have seen this picture on the internet that shows the dragon sizes, and Ancalagon's literally like bigger than a mountain range or something. And that's obviously impractical in the story that I was trying to tell.
And so thinking now about Scholomance, which is something completely new, how did you come up with that idea? And you mentioned Harry Potter, so I will say it's billed as a super dark Harry Potter with a female lead.
Well, so there are 3 core inspirations for Scholomance. And one is very obviously Harry Potter. One is the Scholomance, which is a folk legend. But again, it's a folk legend filtered through my childhood experience of it, which I'll say more. And the third element, which is not at all obvious, is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Le Guin. And I often say like any story has a family tree, and those are the ancestors of this one. Harry Potter, I think, and interestingly, it's not necessarily Harry Potter so much as Harry Potter fandom. In which, I've written Harry Potter fanfic. And one of the things, with Harry Potter, this is my own personal little soapbox. I feel very strongly that Harry Potter is fundamentally about a woman wanting to give her child things. That it's a mother wanting to give her child stuff, who can't afford to give her child stuff. And that's why, one of the reasons that Harry Potter is the huge, gigantic juggernaut that it is the merchandising. And the reason for it, in my opinion, is that it is so vivid. It is so deeply realized, like every shop, the sensation of like the pile of gold. But of course, the whole message throughout of it is that it's all crap. Like you would so much rather have your mom, right, than this stuff. But it's the stuff that is sort of a vicarious giving of things, and giving of friends, and giving of place, of all these, even of a quest, right? And so the thing is, and so I do, I'm not one of those people who's like, who thinks that's bad, right? I think that, obviously the point of it, that's kind of, it's doing what it wants to do. But because of that, so many things are not fully worked out. Like the economy of the wizarding world makes no sense, right? You can make things. They're wizards. And you don't seem to have to pay for magic, right? Magic doesn't seem to have a cost. You have to learn how to cast a spell, but once you can cast it, you seem to be able to just throw it off. So why are the Weasleys, who have 8 adult trained wizards, all competent, poor, and the Malfoys, who have 2 parents and like 1 scrawny kid, are like the rich aristocrats, right? It makes no sense. And so that economy of magic, right, is one of those things that is one of those places where conversation happens for me that I was talking about, right? There's like, this thing doesn't work, it's inconsistent. And obviously it's inconsistent because she's doing, like the British aristocracy, and, their connections to fascism and the Nazis. But at the same time, and this is, another thing where obviously this is clearly not deliberate, but I myself look at, you've created this community of wizards who are anxiously policing intermarriage, and they live in isolated walled communities and they're a minority community living in isolated walled, this is a ghetto, right? This is Orthodox Judaism. And now you're turning those people into the Nazis. And that sort of, especially with Snape, right, is one of these, is positioned as one of the Death Eater kind of pureblood apologist characters. And again, he has a lot of the same signifiers. Rumpelstiltskin, the hook nose, the greasy hair, the Malfoys with the focus on wealth, and so those are, and in Harry Potter, those are all signifiers that have been brought in from other stories, right? She's not actually doing a deliberate anti-Semitic story. She's going from Rumpelstiltskin, which, if you don't look at it and read it in a kind of resisting reader way, you don't know that it's just a fairy tale that you were told as a kid and doesn't occur to you, right? And so some of those tropes come in, and a lot of these sort of uncontrolled tropes, I would say, get gathered into Harry Potter. And what that results in is places where it's sort of squishy, I like to think of it, right? Where you can sort of be like, well, this kind of doesn't work. And that offers places for a lot of creativity, a lot of inserting yourself. And so obviously the pieces that I brought into Scholomance from that are the magic is not free. Right, the idea that you have to make the power to cast your spells every single time, and where are you getting that power from? How does it built? What does it mean? And so then you can have an economy of magic. You can have people who have lots of that power. How did they get it? Well, the same way you get it in the real world. It becomes a story about exploitation, and other pieces, I would say, obviously the magic boarding school trope is a classic trope, very much because it lets you tell a story about becoming, right? It lets you, even the boarding school story, it's a story about a magnified story, an amplified story of becoming, because the parents are removed, you're in with your peers, you are out from one-on-one adult supervision, and it's at the point of adolescence, right? It's basically the point where absolutely shit, and you're trying to figure yourself out, and you're trying to become an adult. And all of us who are adults have been through that process. And so for instance, people often ask me, is it YA, is it adult? To me, it's an adult story because we're all actually still trying to find out who are we going to become. But situating it at the point of adolescence means that it's deeply fraught, right? It's more amplified. And then you make it magic, and now these are characters who are becoming magical. That means that you can amplify the stakes of your story, and you can change the setting of your world in order to give the characters agency that's far more than on a personal level, right? And so that it starts to matter more, their choices start to matter on a grander scale. And then, and what that does is it lets you make them scarier. And that's obviously, so in the Scholomance, I think everybody's had the situation of you walk into a room, you don't know anybody there, and you're like, which table am I going to sit at? You've got your tray, the tables are all full, you've got to sit with somebody, who are you going to sit with? But it's literally it lets me make that literally life and death stakes in the book in a way that it emotionally feels to us in that moment. And that connection to the sort of visceral experience, I think, is really powerful.
And so of the 3 books, because the third one is coming out, it's available for pre-order now.
Yes.
Was there a big was one easier? Was one harder?
No, I would say, what I'm increasingly trying to do, and I tried to do on Scholomance and failed, was I'm trying to write my contracts with my publisher so that I write the whole thing first and figure out how we're going to divide it up into books after. So that I can tell the story from start to finish. And so when I met with my editor, I was like, this is going to be a duology. It's going to be 2 books. And I knew that I wanted it to be in separate books as opposed to a single book because I wanted the punctuation of the school year, right? I feel like the punctuation of closing a book and opening the next book, that's a powerful, that literally happens to us in childhood over and over and over again, and we're right in it right now, the school year, the summer has ended, school year is about to begin. And I wanted that rhythm in the work. I wanted that sense of okay, and now we're level up, next step up. But so I knew what was going to happen at the end of book 1. And I was writing towards it. I'm like, I'm going to get these 2 books done, and then I'll edit the whole thing together. And so the second book, I would be able to work on the second book and do the copy edits and revisions before the first one was even published. But then I woke up one morning and a scene was in my head, and I went and I wrote the scene, and it was the last scene of the first book, and it was not where I thought it was going to be. And I sort of sat there, and then I was like, wrote to my agent being like, I need a 3rd book. And at that point, so the ending that I thought was going to be the ending of book 1 became the ending of book 2. And then I was able to get a large way into book 2 and part of book 3 before book 1 was published. But I wasn't able to finish book 3 completely, and so there were things that I hadn't figured out yet. And of course, I've been doing these Instagram live readings of the first chapter for the last couple weeks. Like, first question, so what about this scene in book 1 that's sort of like, why can Orion like hold why is he too full of mana when in book 2 he can, store the mana of the entire New York Enclave? And I'm like, curse it. So like,
Because you didn't know the answer.
I didn't know the answer. Because there was, I had to hand
read
wave
the
it.
book, yeah.
Yeah, well, and the answer that I gave was, when I have that moment as a writer, when I have the moment where I've figured out an answer, something that is true in my story, that is the right thing in my story, if it's inconsistent with a line or 2 in the first one, I will go ahead with the thing that is true, and just come up with some bad hand-waving explanation for the for the inconsistency, because the overall truth is more important.
Right, okay. So for our podcast ending, we usually invite our guests to give a prompt.
Well, could I ask one thing first?
Yes.
And I know this is the question that we ask all writers, but if you have to give one advice to writers that are, what would you tell them?
My advice is finish a lot of stuff.
Okay.
Just
finish.
Sorry.
Okay.
The reason, but I don't necessarily mean like finish your novel, which is a big thing. I mean, you have to write and finish a lot of things because, writing is literally, it's like weightlifting. It's like anything. The things that you do the most are the things that you get good at and the things that you can do better. Very often, writers have an idea, a cool idea, and they start writing it because it's burning a hole in your brain and you want to get it done. You get along partway in, and you hit a problem, right? You're in a corner and you can't figure out how to get out of it. By the way, if you are in such a place, the answer is set something on fire. Works almost every time. However you interpret that in the context of your character scene, set something on fire and you'll see. But so when that is, and so then very often what happens is people are like, okay, I'm going to go to the next thing. And they start another thing. And then they go back and they start another thing. When you do that, what you get very good at is starting things, creating good new ideas. You don't get good at forcing your way through the problems, forcing your way through those stopping points where your narrative is sort of hanging. And you also don't get good at the endings, and endings are super important. One of the reasons that I'm trying to arrange it so that I have enough time to write an entire story before any part of it is published is because very often, being a discovery writer, I don't know what my story's about until I finish it. And if I can still edit it, I can make it all true. I can make it all cohere in a much better way, because for me, the ideal landing, the ideal ending is you finish the thing and you're like, wow, I have to go back to the beginning and read it all over again, because now I totally am going to see everything in a completely different light, right? That, or just, if you have a better memory for books than I do, you just realize, you just rethink the book in that way. And to me, that's always what I want from an ending, that it should feel deeply satisfying and revelatory. Yeah.
Sometimes your beginning's going to change after you get the ending, so you don't know that.
And so, but the thing is that you have to end stuff. And in fact, for me, I didn't know that's what I was doing when I was writing all those very short pieces. But I was, I was learning how to end a thing. Now when I write the final sentence of a chapter or a story, I know that's the end. I know that's the last sentence. I'm like, that's the landing. And very often I will change things beforehand to make it the landing of the story. Because when you get that line, you have to respect it, But that's something that you don't learn to recognize if you're not doing it a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yes, so we ask our authors to please give us a prompt so that you writers out there can write it down and you can go home and do Naomi Novik's prompt.
So, as I was saying to them, that the prompt that I would give is find something that you're working on and finish it. That's my real, that's my real prompt. But I think that's sort of a more creative prompt is, I would say, choose the fairy tale that you either love the most or hate the most, and write something inspired by it. Don't retell it, just write something that sort of speaks to it. It could be a modern day story that's just sort of inspired by the fairy tale. Just take a fairy tale and work with it.
Okay.
So before we get to questions and answers, we're going to do a little bit outro to make it easier for our editor later. That's all we have time for today. And thank you so much, Naomi Novik, for sharing your wisdom. And please applaud. And we want to give a special thanks to the Westport Library and all of its staff and community for hosting this podcast, and for StoryFest, and for all of those of you who are listening and who are here today.
Very good. So this has
Thank you, I did it right.
This has been Go Ahead, Write Something. Remember that writing can be hard, but you don't have to do it alone, and we hope you'll join us next time.
Thank
That's
you.
it.
So now thank you so much. This was
And now
fun.
for our Q&A. So you'll see
If you could come over here with your questions for Naomi, we have time for about 3 questions. And then we'll go to the book signing.
And please, you do not have to read the book, but you do have to buy it.
Buy it as a gift.
Support your writers, and they'll support you.
Hello, I just wanted to say AO3 is fantastic, and it's a great way for people to, get into writing. It's such an honor to be on a panel, or be present at a panel where you're speaking. I guess my question is, I've been a part of multiple fandoms and reading and creating content, and a lot of people see, professional commercial success. They publish stories. They're now published authors based on their success and their audience on fan fiction, but you're probably one of the first ones I see that are actively still creating fan fiction and sharing those original stories and creating fan-inspired stories. So I'm wondering, as a published author, how you see the industry reacting to fan fiction over time. I imagine it's changed so much since you started AO3.
It did, absolutely. And obviously part of the things that changed it were itself AO3. I remember when I first started writing, for me, there's that saying, right? Fandom is a way of life. And that's true for some people. And then there's the other one, which is fandom is just another goddamn hobby. I'm very much feel all, fandom's a way of life. That was something for me that I knew I was not going to give up. But at the time when I started writing it, it was still generally the accepted and standard practice that when you went pro, you scrubbed your fan fiction history. You changed your name, you moved to another country, basically, right, the equivalent. And I knew I wasn't going to do that, and I knew I was not going to set myself up for some sort of weird gotcha where someone's like, ooh, she writes fan fiction on the internet. I told my editors up front. I was very open about it. Whenever I was asked to conventions, I would stand up and sort of talk about fan fiction as being my background. And I did it quite aggressively because I feel I am effectively an activist about this. And because for me, fan fiction was so intensely important for me. That community was so intensely important for me. I want other people to have that freedom, to have that gift as well. And I remember still, like I think probably the first year after my books came out, I was on a panel with people, and somebody on the panel was like, well, I just don't understand why people don't write why they don't just write, original stories. And I sort of looked at this panel, I was like, how many people on this panel play an instrument, right? And about half of them, including the guy who had spoken first, raised their hands. It was like, so how many pieces of original composition have you made? When was your last performance at Carnegie Hall? Why aren't you practicing, with a coach? And when's your next audition? And as soon as you sort of said that, I think people were like, oh, right, you could just do it because it's fun. And I do think that there's a certain kind of difficulty for people because for so many people, writing is turned into boring drudgery work in school, right? It's made into something that you're forced to do, and obviously the things we're forced to do, most of us are like a bit contrary. We're like, I don't like that, right? And you have to learn how to love it again sometimes. And for people who haven't learned to love it, who are the people on the outside, they don't quite get it when people are just like, oh, I just do it for fun. And obviously, I would have to say that, in fact, the thing that changed things hugely and dramatically for the better was 50 Shades of Grey. Because as soon as something makes $1 billion in the US, nobody cares anymore. Everyone's like, oh, it's great. It's the best thing ever, right? And so now when you're like, oh, I write fan fiction, people are like, oh, like that thing that made all that money. And it's fine, right? Then you're like, you're buying a lottery ticket or something, I don't know. But the main piece is that you just have to sort of, for me, writing was, for those 10 years when I did it without ever thinking of going pro, it was just joy. And I've never lost that. And I often speak to other writers, other professional writers, who do sort of think of it a little bit like treasure. I'm like, no, it's like you were sort of asking me like, it should be work, it should be hard. I'm like, no, it should be fun. Because that's what it is for me. And I do think that it helps if you can find the joy in it, and focus on the joy, and the joy for yourself. Look, there are other ways to make a living. It doesn't have to be a career. It can be something that you do, the same way that you pick up a guitar and go and jam with friends in the park on a beautiful sunny day. To me, that's what I was doing. I was posting stories, sharing them online. I was reading the comments. I was chatting with my friends. I was getting beta reading on it. And yeah, that's my little spiel I had.
Hi, my question is more specifically in the Scholomance. So with most mouths, they seem to be creatures that are created just from random animals or constructs or things like that. But a Moormouth is, arguably, it's just a bunch of people all crammed into one. And when Orion takes mouths apart, he says he takes them apart and pulls the mana out of them. But if a Moormouth is essentially human souls all in one thing, would that affect his ability to tear them apart with I'm wondering if that
I'm
would
sorry,
be
I'm
sort
going to
of
cut you off here. You have to read the books.
Oh, no.
Sorry,
Read
no,
it,
you have to rate for book 3. Sorry,
Okay.
I can't. No, spoiler question. No spoilers.
No spoilers.
No spoilers.
Okay.
Sorry.
Good question, though.
I will
Good
say, I will
question.
say, I believe your question will be answered. All right? Yes, I will say, actually one of the interesting, if you do get the handbook, one of the fun things about the handbook that I did for it was I published my taxonomy of Maleficaria. So if you look at it, you'll see the way that the mouths are sort of organized into a little sort of kingdom phylum kind of arrangement, which is how I was constructing most of them in my head.
Hi. One of my favorite parts about the Scholomance series is the class and social dynamics that you've created within the Scholomance. And it just seems so relevant to things that are going on in this country with class right now. So I was wondering if your work is in conversation with any current events.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, I was writing it largely after 2016, and I, in rage. And obviously, it's also clear. I think for me, it's very much about climate change. It's about the debts that we pass down to our children. It's about. I have a kid in school in Manhattan. And it's about that. And it's a lot of these things were in that book. And obviously those things also connect back to Omelas, right? The ones who walk away from Omelas. And it's, in the legend of the Scholomance, right? In the legend of the Scholomance, you have this terrible school that people go into for 10 years, and when they leave, the devil keeps the soul of the last one to pay for their schooling, right? And that story, right, it's about, that is a story, obviously, that connects clearly for me to exploitation. And the Scholomance itself, as one of the things that kind of crystallized for me, I was about a third of the way through. If you look at the end papers and you see the design of the Scholomance, I realized at a certain point that it was not this kind of the stones, the old cathedral-like stone building of our imaginations when we say a school of magic. It was this industrial, Titanic-scaled thing that you could sort of see grinding things up, right, with gears that are turning, and that sense of machinery amplifying the forces of exploitation, an engine of exploitation, and that's a core theme that I think carries through the whole story for me.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and oh my God, that was so much fun. Okay, everybody, we have to switch over the stage for the next event, but here's the deal. Obviously, buy some of Naomi's books, get your freebie handbook. There are still books in our bookstore available for purchase by the other authors of StoryFest, and they'll be here tonight so you can have them sign if you haven't already had them sign. So please feel free to buy books and stick around for our next event that starts at 6.